When I listened back to this episode, something really stayed with me. And it was a brief moment in amongst all the value that today's guest, Ian, was saying. But he briefly mentioned the journey of basically being in his process of living beyond patriarchal sex. And I find that heartening because that's the honesty that it takes to be part of this. And the women that I know are not wanting men to be in a perfect place, but to at least be in the inquiry that translates into behavior that shows a deconditioning process at least is happening. And something else that really stayed with me is the chance that Ian offers to understand the male experience in the way that he describes it. For example, what it takes to really be involved in men's work and how that includes a willingness to admit a sense of defeat, meaning that he can't do it all on his own. And I was reflecting on cartoons and movies and, comics that boys often take in and how it shows very often a singular male hero that boys are conditioned with deeply in their subconscious minds, and it steers them in that direction. And it has relevance, as an inner experience of challenge and success and the individual journey, but it doesn't portray what's needed to become fully developed as a man. So boys and men are fed that imagery that he is or must climb to be on top of a hierarchy that's above others, above women, above nature, above intimacy, above life. And that's how I see patriarchy is to a man's detriment, because it sells him a fantasy that's not real life. And in the process of admitting defeat, moving from the hero archetype to a more collaborative or more human self, it isn't actually about his failure as a man when he's admitting defeat. It's actually seems to be a failure of the culture that is being recognized and how that's affected him personally. And so, my guest today, Ian MacKenzie, shares beautifully about all of this from his mythic perspective on the inner journey of men's development in how that relates to patriarchal sex. Welcome, everyone, to this provocative and heartfelt podcast, Beyond Patriarchal Sex, a place for both women and men to elevate ourselves, finding out what it takes to live beyond our conditioning and assumptions, not only for ourselves, but also for the coming generations. My name is Devashi Shakti, and you are warmly welcome to be part of these conversations. Hey, so I'm so happy to say that I'm here today with Ian MacKenzie. And I'll read a little bit about you, Ian, for everyone listening. So, Ian MacKenzie is a mythosomatic guide and filmmaker, as well as the founder of the Mythic Masculine, a platform dedicated to realigning masculinity with thriving life. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that means to you, Ian?
Mm-hmm. Well, that particular phrase, thriving life, is from an Indigenous grandmother, Pat McCabe. And she's quite an activist, visionary, crone. I mean, she's amazing. And I've known her for a number of years. I can't remember where we first connected. It might have been at Finhorn in Scotland or one of these kind of gatherings. And I think she took a liking to me for seeing she does work with Men's Nation, as she calls it, to heal Men's Nation. And she saw what I was also doing. And so I had an interview with her that I did for my podcast. This is number of years ago now. And it's called Thriving Life and a Prayer for All Men. And that is one of my most listened to podcast episodes because she really offers a beautiful energy around kind of like, right, she worked through her own blame of men. Like she worked through that sense that, men are the problem and like sort of across the board. Yes, men have things to do and heal, but that men are also are harmed by patriarchy. And
Yeah.
so she transmuted a lot of that energy within her. And she really came to this authentic place where, and of course, rooted in her own indigenous tradition. But at the end of it, I asked her if she might offer a prayer for men and a blessing. And she did. And that particular piece, I mean, men write me and say they're weeping by the end of it because a lot of men actually don't know that they actually want that, right? That they're craving a blessing, particularly from the grandmother. Like we're not inherently wrong and bad, right? But there's this sense of being called up, called forth. And so that transmission she offers is just profoundly beautiful. And she uses this phrase, thriving life. And a few years into my work with men and doing particularly the in-person stuff that we do, that phrase kept repeating for me. And I realized I was like, oh, this is what we're doing. This is what we're helping to realign masculinity with thriving life. And so I asked her, I said, hey, Pat, do you mind if I use that phrase in what I do? She's like, no, go for it. And so there you have it.
I love it. My gosh, I think we can all feel so much about you just from that answer already. And is it okay if I ask you how it felt for you personally to be invited onto a podcast called Beyond Patriarchal Sex? Does it bring up anything for you?
Well, I'm fortunate to be steeped in this, I don't know, you call it this understanding for a little while now, because and we'll probably get to it, but I'm the co-director of a film called The Village of Lovers, which is about the radical eco-village project in Timera, or it's called Timera, but it's in Portugal. And it was there actually that I encountered a lot of these initial frames around what does society look like outside of sort of patriarchal conditioning and patriarchal framing. And Tamara is deeply focused on healing the relationship between men and women. And so a lot of this, I've kind of encountered and been sort of undone by and, stitched myself back together. And so I feel like I was sort of saddled for this kind of conversation because, myself and two other filmmakers spent the better part of a decade making this film. We visited the community 4 times over 5 years, and again worked with all the interviews and their research in ways that I feel I must have a PhD or something in Tamara, which really is meant to be an experiment around a society beyond patriarchy. That's one of their core explorations, and so how eroticism and sex and sacred sexuality and healing, all of that, how that is held and explored in the community, really demonstrated to me a completely different paradigm than I grew up in, and the majority of folks probably who grew up in modern society have experienced. And it's hard to picture something else, right? Because it's just what we experience. Patriarchal sex, you kind of have to add that as a label to draw attention to the fact that it's a certain kind of sex. It's not just how sex is, right? It's
Yeah,
actually sex within within a conditioned paradigm that is so much the water we swim in. Rian Eisler might call it domination culture, right, as another frame. So that's my take on it, and so I feel excited to be here.
yeah, excellent. I actually saw that film about Tamara in Portugal not long after it came out, actually, and I had no idea that you made that film. It was actually Carly Mountain. She was on episode 8, if I'm remembering correctly, and she suggested that we connect. So thanks to Carly. And
Hmm.
yes, so
Carly and I actually, yeah, we have a beautiful episode, by the way, Carly. I mean, I talked about the descent of Inanna and Gilgamesh and Enkidu with her, and then I invited her on actually to talk about Barbie, the movie Barbie, as a Inanna descent story, and it was amazing. It was really fun and interesting, and yeah, folks want to check that out. They can find that on my podcast too.
yeah, that's really interesting. I could never quite bring myself to watch that Barbie film, to be honest, but maybe one day.
Oh yeah, I'd say maybe listen to our episode and then go watch it. Then you'll enjoy it. I bet you will. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Um, so something you just said before, Ian, naming patriarchal sex implies, doesn't it, that that's not just how sex is. The way that most people are being intimate with each other is from a particular paradigm. So this leads me to the question I'm asking everyone, which is, what is patriarchal sex according to you?
Hmm. Well, I suppose to narrow it down initially, if we speak about the act of sexual exploration or connection or the encounter of sex as physical bodies, finding each other and hopefully pleasure, or that to me, patriarchal sex is conditioned by a kind of, yeah, I know, a subtle and or sometimes overt domination, right? And this is why I brought up Rian Eisler earlier because she explains it so well that sex in this case is not really about sex. Actually, I would say patriarchal sex is kind of not really about sex. It's about power and control and domination. You mentioned that you've seen some of the work that I've put out around stealing the key, men, sex, and the mother complex, and how that speaks to this understanding that from, if you want to call it patriarchal consciousness, that women become the sole source of what I might just say like the feminine source, right? If you want to get, Jungian, you might say it's like the outer projection of their inner anima. And so, patriarchy as a whole, this is something that my another guest, Maya Luna, a poet in San Francisco, I believe she's based. Yeah, we had a conversation about this, and she described patriarchy as the collective loss of the goddess. Right when a sort of cultural framework essentially loses reverence for the goddess, and then it becomes imbalanced into a relationship that is actually characterized by like this core schism, right? Where in this misunderstanding between these archetypal forces, you say the masculine and feminine, then one, in this case, masculinity in this context, rises to dominate and control. And in many ways creates the conditions for scarcity, which is actually, it's kind of a bizarre understanding. But, and I saw this again and again at Tamara, when you have a culture where that society is conditioned around, I mean, women being subordinate to men or feeling generally unsafe, or needing to rely upon men for economic advantage, for protection, things like that. Then women have an inherent sort of mistrust and need to protect themselves, actually, right? To stay kind of closed. If you think about a flower blooming, it's like, a flower's not going to bloom if it doesn't feel safe. And so in this context, it kind of ironically or not causes many women to actually be shut down and closed. And that introduces scarcity, actually. So, and then it's no wonder you have men competing for the validity or favor or control of female bodies and access to sex because of the conditions of the system that actually introduced it in the first place. So all of that to say, patriarchal sex to me is one not really about sex. It's about, yeah, again, control, domination, and like unconscious patterns of consumption that are trying to fill a void that can never be filled through more consumption. I call this the King Haggard symptom, right, of the tyrant king and all of the unicorns from the unicorn film, The Last Unicorn, chased into the sea and kind of held in control instead of flourishing throughout the land, which is actually what abundance looks like. So I'll stop there for a second.
Yes. Yeah, excellent answer. Thank you so much. And I mean, one of the many things that stands out to me is it's trying to fill a void that can never be filled. That's such an important point. That the consumption and the extraction of the feminine through women and yeah, just mass consumption of women's bodies, entitlement to the female body, it doesn't matter how much that becomes available and perverse and, ready 24/7 on the internet, for example, it never actually creates
Mm.
fulfillment in the man. Yeah.
Well, it just reminds me too. I did a post, shared a post maybe about a month or so ago, and I called it AI and the Ghost of the Feminine. And what I was speaking to is that very similar to what you're naming there is that a lot of men are caught in this pattern, right? This trap of wanting connection, wanting nourishment from the feminine, if we'll just call it that more broadly, and yet not being able to succeed in achieving it, whether internally, right, through their own practices of tapping that, I call it the inner wellspring, or even women in the outside world who are maybe mistrustful and require emotional tending and all the things it takes to be in a relationship. And so they get this substitute. And I think it's a woman named Carolyn Casey. She's like a sort of a trickster poet from the US, but she uses this phrase, toxic mimic, where something seems to be the thing that you're looking for, but it's actually not. It's a mimic. In fact, it's a toxic mimic. It means it can never actually, again, satiate that. And so what we saw, or what we have seen with pornography, not all pornography, but pornography, of course, that is meant to be exploitative and trigger a kind of consumptive, hungry ghost mentality, now hyper enhanced with AI, is it's providing this toxic mimic to an exponential level for men who feel maybe for a moment that it's the real thing, right? It's the real connection and contact and reciprocity, which is, I think, what they're longing for. But of course, this thing can never provide. It's the ghost. It's the ghost of the feminine.
And yes, when it comes to men interacting with pornography and the ghost of the feminine through AI, um, the people that study it quite scientifically from a brain chemistry level talk about how um, it sort of suppresses the drive to want to actually connect with a real woman because it doesn't really fulfill us, but at the same time, it pretends to satiate a part of the human brain in the man that would otherwise be available for connection or longing for connection. And so, with
Mm.
that being suppressed, it just amplifies the whole situation, doesn't it?
Mm. Yeah, just maybe last thing to say about that is for me, it's kind of like junk food, right? Like junk food can, if you're hungry, junk food can temporarily fill, the fix, but it's not real nourishment, of course. And it's very common for people to get hooked on junk food, right? That's like all they eat. And so they if you haven't experienced a real thing, like a real nourishing, healthy food, right, you may not even know it's possible because all you've lived and gotten used to is, again, this mimic.
Yes, it is exactly that. It is junk food. And, that's where the fulfillment doesn't get to happen because there's no actual nutrient in it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a few things I would really love to track with you in this because I'm inspired to ask you about a couple of things. But you mentioned earlier, Ian, this sense of hesitancy or fear or trepidation that can come up in women in being available to men, like for good reason, for many things that have happened over many generations. Um, and that's true, and that's a real thing. And at the same time, there actually, in my experience, are a lot of women that are available for connection, and yet this approach in many men that are in their patriarchal mindset still, dominating their nervous system and their urges, um, is still trying to extract from her in a way that doesn't allow a real meeting of actual intimacy. And this is where I really love Brienne's work myself, who you mentioned, because she basically reveals how actual partnership, which is what real intimacy leads to, is not possible. Like it's a totally different model. So if operating under patriarchy, there is no partnership possibility truly, right?
Hmm. What? Yeah, I might say it too because it's an uneven power dynamic. That's maybe how I translate what you're saying. Because if I'll just again speak to the act of a erotic encounter, a sexual encounter between a man and a woman. If the man is conditioned to be at a distance from his emotional body, right, in his own nervous system, he is actually not even present to himself, and likely unconsciously is therefore also keeping the woman at a distance, right? A sort of there's like a abyss that just can't be crossed, and that maybe the woman's feeling like, "Where are you? Where are you?" Like, and he's, "What do you mean? I'm here. I'm here." But because the conditioning is deep and the relationality hasn't been established in the man. Like there's only a sense of how to, we can say penetrate, right? How to express or enact force in that way, but not be penetrated back through like vulnerability and letting oneself, a man, be seen, let's say, by his partner, which is, I think, the act of that reciprocity. I think that's a lot where that aspect's coming from, like this lack of fulfillment, right? For
Mm.
men not even aware actually of what's possible because they haven't done that bridging within themselves yet.
Yeah, yeah. And, I like to say somewhere in every episode that, because people need to keep hearing it, that, and you and I are so on board with this already, and it's hopefully evident for everything that we've shared, but patriarchy is to the detriment of men as well as women. And, this conversation is about opening up a lot of different aspects around that. But like what you were saying in when a man is not in a relationship with his inner nature, his inner feminine principle, his deeper feelings, his vulnerability, his sensations of his inner body, if that relationship is just a void, it's not even there, how can he possibly relate to a woman with those levels of subtlety and textures in the emotional field? Is the abyss instead, like you said. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it might be worth saying, and maybe you've covered this in different conversations that you've had already too, but I mean, basically the origins of patriarchy and how might it have arisen? Because, yeah, I think, it is, I go back and forth sometimes, right? It's very, can be used secondhand to mean just everything that's terrible with the world. And I think there's actually an important distinction to be made. And this is where Reiser, I think, can be very helpful, of course, because she brings in these different terminologies. But I'll just say that the resist people that resist using this kind of terminology, right, and
Yeah.
confuse it, I think, with wanting like weak men, right? You'll see this a lot on the alt-right. Basically, there's, people who say they don't want patriarchy. That means they want weak men, men who can't stand up for themselves and protect their women and children. Like you can feel the energy there. It's like the patriarchy is the way, and you get guys saying we need more patriarchy, actually. And so it's hard to understand that, right? Unless you actually see, I think, what the inner workings that are going on there.
And
Because,
yeah,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and in that, it sounds like that guy's definition of what patriarchy is masculinity, is male leadership, whereas it doesn't actually equal that to you and I, right?
The patriarchy.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Because patriarchy, in this sense, means I'll say this that I've done some research into the origins of patriarchy and like how might it have risen, even from a mythic perspective, and it makes sense to consider that with the advent of war, of clashing intertribal warfare, that if a particular tribe has decided that what those people over there have, we want, and move into their warrior patriarchal structure, right, in order to attack or pillage or whatever that is, conquer, then the other tribe kind of has to do the same or risk being overtaken, right, and captured, and the women taken, and all these kinds of things. So they kind of also have to arrange themselves into a warrior culture. And so, in a sense, you can see how it's actually kind of like a natural response to threat, right? And this is also, I think, there's important in this, in the roots of this, because I think in a cultural time when, or a societal time when the threat would dissipate, and a culture could then go back to just being, villagers or a culture again. Then I think that's usually how it operated. It was like temporary, right, to kind of reestablish in order to fight off a threat. But as threat became more and more common, land pillaging and colonization and things began spreading, and then it became like a constant threat. So like people had to be constantly on alert, constantly in warrior mode. Therefore, you kind of want patriarchy, right? In those times, you want warriors ready to fight on your behalf to protect the women and children. You don't want them sitting around in circle, like processing their feelings, right? You want warriors out there ready to, do what needs to be done. So I think there's something in this that like got stuck in like the patterning, sort of up until now, present day, where men have this inbound fear, right, of being more vulnerable, because literally vulnerable means to be exposed, right, to be exposed. And in a dominator culture hierarchy, that is a weakness, actually, because the stoic, man who can dominate. I'm thinking of Andrew Tate, of course, right, who I listened to an 2 hour interview with him and his therapist, actually, this fellow, David Sutcliffe. Fascinating interview. Yeah, because here's this guy who, commands attention from a lot of young men because he is really this archetype of patriarchal masculinity, like, or an avatar even. He's like he's kind of like almost like a cyborg that was programmed to be as patriarchal as possible. It has all the money, has all the cars, can dominate anybody, can win any fight. And that's appealing to a certain adolescent consciousness, right? That's appealing when you feel not empowered, not valued. You're like, man, I want to be like that guy, right? But so he's optimized for a certain system, but that system is a dead end. It's the system that's contributing to the biological or the biospheric breakdown and social collapse and all that, because that it's a finite game within the framework of infinite and finite games. It's a finite
Yeah.
game because you play to win, and if you win, or if we win in this paradigm, life loses. So I'll just stop there for a second.
Yes, part of my awareness is still back at the point where you said Andrew Tate has a therapist. I'm like, what?
Or I should say, he was open to being therapized for two
Okay, that
for
makes
two
more
interviews.
sense.
Yeah,
That makes more sense.
yeah.
Something he can monetize online. Okay, and talk about himself. I get it.
It's fascinating how he does it, though, how he gets to the little boy, actually, how the therapist. It's really worth actually watching near the end, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, for sure. If there's anything of his worth watching, I'm sure that would be the one. Yes, and but it's true, he's definitely tapping into something that has been dormant, and that I do agree part of it needs to be enhanced so that boys are not afraid of the power of their masculinity. Like I'm all for that. I'm totally on board with that. Um, the attitudes towards the feminine, his own inner feminine towards women in that whole paradigm, not just him, is definitely really problematic though. But what you were describing in around this village scenario, were you saying that the men standing up in the warrior combat mode is an expression of patriarchy? Is that what you were saying?
But yeah, if we're talking about the need to organize society within a hierarchy, which is what at least we understand patriarchy to be, because you have to be able to delegate, right? You have to be able to kind of wield power very specifically in order to fight off a threat or whatever that happens to be. Now, that being said, if we speak mythically, though, which I'm sure you've probably done already, but patriarchy, the root of patriarch, is the rule of the father, right? And so a lot of fathers actually too take issue with the word, right? Because they're saying, "What? You don't want more fathering in this culture? We need more fathering, actually." All right, and that's true. We do
Yeah.
need healthy and supportive, grounded fathers. But that's also not what is actually, I think, being spoken to. This is why Rian Eisler's domination culture, I think, gets closer to what we're actually talking about. So the language can be a little confusing for people who are misunderstanding actually what we're speaking to.
Yes, and no one has really highlighted the mythic perspective, so you're very welcome to bring that as much as you want today. But in the very beginning of this podcast, I do explain, the root meaning of the word and what it means and what this project is referring to and what it's not referring to. But I know that not everyone listens to those first episodes to set the context in their mind, so it's good to just bring it in here and there through the episodes. Um, some Just going back to this historical moment, a couple of them that you've mentioned. So a temporary hierarchy for people to organize themselves around the men being physical protectors of the tribe. You were saying it would be temporary, and then that would dissolve, and people would go back to being in a more circular sense of community. But obviously, sometime before that point in the human timeline, there was a move away from actively being in reverence to life to there being a relationship with the goddess as a force. of nature as a universal source. Um, and all the things that happened in between the village scenario that you just described and this more goddess times where the feminine was openly revered and there was a sense of devotion to having her favor for the men, or the women being in direct relationship with that intimate connectedness with the greater feminine eros. Yeah, there's so much that's happened in the timeline between those places, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, we'd have to dig up the full history lesson, but I do think that I understand there was, I think it was Kyrgyzstan-based tribes or something, would came down from the steppes, and those were the ones that worshipped the sky gods and came through and began to conquer all these places. But for me, if I also look at it sort of dual as a mythic evolution, as well as similar to the adolescent evolution of a young man, there's some interesting parallels because in the early stages of a young boy, of course, mother is everything, right? Mother's the source of nourishment. Mother is goddess. Mother is life, sustenance, and there's ideally a reference there, right? For certainly those early years, it's just there's nothing else. It's just mother. And at a certain point, through beginning to explore and test limits and differentiate the sense of identity for a young child, say a young boy, there does seem to be there's this drift. And this is what I speak to in the Mother Complex webinar, where I speak about this idea. And I think I'm not sure if it was either Jung or some of his students spoke to this idea of that at some point the boy needs to move from out of the mother's house, meaning in the psychological house of the mother. And so this is where a lot of adolescent boys begin to, right, sort of pull away from the mother, particularly around puberty, where the erotic, impulse and being starts to come online, and it starts to actually kind of like that part doesn't know how to integrate with the love of the mother, right? Like erotic love and the love of the mother sort of create this like very confusing encounter, I think, for young boys, which is why there's this kind of pulling away and rebelling against the mother as this way to try to differentiate. Also from a sense of being the like nurturing, soft boy, which also has, a cultural framework around that, pushing boys to become more manly and stuff, which is also specific. But there is that impulse to differentiate. And so for me, if I track that in the historical record, it's interesting parallel that in terms of cultural evolution, there was this, wait a second, we don't have to revere the goddess anymore. We can overpower her. And how that thought form, in a way, may have come online into the human evolution, and then put forth a cascading chain of consequence, of which could lead right up until today, when you could say that now there's this spiral back around to be like, okay, well, wait a second, that was a bit of a detour. The goddess is still the everything, and yet, how do we now come back into right relationship with these energies?
Mm, yes, yes. And, a really simplistic way of explaining patriarchy and what's beyond it is to say that, to try and raise himself up, whether from this developmental mythic perspective that you're speaking of, or otherwise, the men trying to raise themselves up, rejecting the goddess, the feminine, in the pursuit of that, dominating, being in that hierarchical model, and the beyond, or the living beyond patriarchal sex possibility that's also there for everyone to connect with, is like realizing that, yes, that happened. And these three words, these three potent words, beyond patriarchal sex, to me says so much because it's not only talking about the beyond, it's actually naming it for what it freaking is, a patriarchal paradigm of sex, intimacy, and relationship that everyone has accepted as the norm. And not until we actually can see that can we truly sustain living beyond it, right? And so it's like the men who've learned how to live beyond it have figured out that there's a way to raise themselves up without putting her down.
Hmm. Yeah. And in fact, actually, that raising her up is actually raises me up or the man up. Yeah,
Yeah.
which is much more a co-creation. And this is also where I see there's an archetypal shift and perhaps an evolution in the spiral of maybe in the past of this mother goddess worship, right? And then going through this phase of trying to dominate and control, realizing that that's a finite game, and that triggering an initiatory process to come into a lover relationship with Earth. To me, seems like a helpful frame around this time that it's actually calling forth again, not just a return to what was, but actually what does it look like to be for humanity to be in a mature lovership with life itself? That to me feels exciting.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Um, what feels most exciting to you about that? What do you perceive as the possibility for man, women, humanity in that?
Well, I'm drawing a little bit from a conversation. I have a longer podcast episode with Charles Eisenstein, which is actually called "From Mother Earth to Lover Earth." So there's some aspects that we speak about in there, but for me, what it represents, and I'll give this example too of in Tamera. So again, this community in Portugal, they arrived in this land that was they were drawn to it. Sabina Lichtenfels, who's the co-founder, she's this beautiful witchy crone, leader in the community. She had this. She was brought to this spring on the land by the shepherd, and she said she had this meditation, and that the goddess actually spoke to her and said, "This is the place." And but it was quite a barren land. It was quite dry, which is part of the region there. And that they set about in a process of deep listening to the land and the beings of the land, the spirits and the animals, and again, starting by presence, right? Starting by making contact and listening. And from that, they, I believe, sort of came up with an understanding of like, how does water want to move on this landscape? And they built a massive lake within the community, and they call it Lake One, which is very German, because they're primarily Germans who are in Portugal. But they call it Lake One, and as a water retention landscape. And through that process, again, it began to fill up and rejuvenate the landscape, and the plants and the animals came back, and it became much more of a thriving ecosystem. And so, for me, that's an example of what it means to be in lovership with Earth, right? Rather than going into a place, as colonization society does, and just decimate everything and build a strip mall. That's obviously like it's a domination relationship, which is diminishing as well. It diminishes the place, right? And farming from this same methodology is you just diminish the soil until it can't do anything anymore, and then you kind of move on, which is really the same thing: exploitation, domination, consumption. But permaculture, as a process, right, again, is this process of deep listening and courtship and co-creation. And again, this goes back to what I was saying that. To the lover, the field of like mutual co-creation, play, and generativity is infinite, right? And to the domination relationship, the encounter, it's finite, right? So this is what I mean by the whole domination culture introduces scarcity, whereas from true relationship and partnership, abundance is actually the outcome.
Yes. And abundance for everyone. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing in this eco direct relationship with Earth, with nature into this, because to me, um, we'll be able to have enough available energy to focus, thinking of humanity as a collective. But if we can't appreciate and respect the feminine within us, both men and women, right? All genders, um, we can't really have the attunement that it takes to extend what has to come from within to our environment. And something very simple is that any intelligent living organism is is going to respect its own environment. That's just what makes sense. That's what an intelligent being would do, which says how what an unintelligent manner so much of humanity is operating from.
Mm.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. I would say too, so this brings me actually to the work that I do with men. now, which is, I've had the podcast for about 5 or so years. And a few years ago, I actually began weaving a number of the threads that I learned at Tamara, as well as the mytho-poetic lineage, which is what I've been also speaking from here. And we created an event for men, a weekend, which we call Awakening the Wild Erotic. And this very kind of explicitly is attempting to support men in both having an initiatory experience into their erotic beings, which is something that basically none of them got. I didn't get when I was 14, 15. Get initiation into essentially right relationship with their sexual energy and power, as well as it is meant to heal any blockages and conditioning around, again, keeping this understanding of eros as only relating to sexuality, like physical sex, basically. And what we lead the men through in the processes is actually opening them up to understand that eros is actually the primal force of life itself and the intelligence of life. And so when men kind of open the blinders to that, that's what we call awe, a direct experience of awe, which then allows them to kind of like wake up from the dream, right? The dream of colonization and conditioning that says this is just stuff, it's just a backdrop to like, oh, wow, this is life itself and I'm life. And wow, I got to protect this. This is important, right? So that there is that natural desire to serve from awakening to the mystery itself. And I think that's what you're speaking to as well. Like unless a man has gone through that portal, it's like it's just all theoretical. But
Yeah.
when they have direct encounter, and maybe even an erotic encounter, let's say with a woman that is deeply from a paradigm of relationality and like co-creation, I mean, I'm sure they're just completely blown. They understand how narrow their experience of sexuality was before, within the patriarchal bottle.
Yes, yes. And coming from an embodied perspective, many times, I'm sure you've had this too out on the land with the work that you do, but just honing in on one experience from my memory of, I was with a singing circle of women with Paraquat actually. And we were doing so much opening of our wombs to our throats, through our hearts, and just hours and hours of it actually. And afterwards, I went and sat on the earth and I actually physically, visually saw her breathing, and this is a
Mm.
very real thing, but I understand it's just mystical or theoretical to people that aren't in their body to experience that direct connection that is already there when we're actually inside of ourselves to be present to it, to notice it. And the awe
Mhm.
that you spoke about, Ian, it's the same as in a beautiful, organic, true unfolding of the sexual current between two people. And you say when a woman's body is fully flowering open, or when you get to witness a woman in her full glory during childbirth, like that's pure awe, right? And when men
Yeah.
get to witness this and see this, and this is where the work that I do with women comes in, where a lot of women aren't comfortable with that in themselves, that direct primal instinctual relationship. And so the work that I do with the Tigress Path is all about creating that safety, creating that context. But for a woman to really own that and live from that place, and for a man to be able to witness it regularly, maybe not childbirth regularly, but at least through sexuality, in the way I see it, this is repatterning us and repatterning us and reweaving us back into the organic life matrix. And we have so much possibility to be, yeah, experiencing ourselves in the interconnectedness with that every time that we make love.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said.
Women often ask me how they can get their partner into this exploration of living beyond patriarchal sex. And my answer is often this: to firstly open a wider discussion by listening to a podcast episode here together, and to take the patriarchal sex survey together, which you will find a link for under the description with each episode. You could also share this episode and discuss it with friends. And you can be part of this women's community where you will deepen relationship with yourself first, which then brings a different version of you to intimacy with highly effective practices. You can do this through a private mentoring intensive with myself, in group events happening globally online and sometimes in person. So join the email list from the tigresspath.com website to free yourself as a woman and be part of this evolution. You didn't have those rites of passage when you were a boy, becoming a young man. And so probably, you had your own inner experience, but you were in the context of a very dominated patriarchal culture. And so what is some of the transition points or moments that stand out from memory of what you had to face in yourself to kind of dismantle this inorganic, false structure that you were kind of told or was modeled to you of this is how life is, this is how reality is, this is how relationship is?
Hmm. Well, I can say up front, so I'm not fully beyond it, I should say. Certainly not. It's a work in progress. And at the same time, yeah, there's a certain amount I can maybe claim to have worked on, to have managed to, yeah, integrate enough to be able to see and proceed somewhat differently. And that I think this idea of a kind of like transactional relationship with sex, right? That's a big one that a lot of men only understand, right? It's like a transaction versus, again, like a deep reciprocity or a courtship, right? These are all aspects that I think I've, managed to either, it's the road of ashes that taught me a lot, actually, right? And in the Iron John story, which has become a deep myth of initiating masculinity, made famous by Robert Bly, that he speaks about the road of ashes when the prince, has to do time in the kitchen to basically kind of sift through all of the, grand ideas and, relationships he thought he had and the rest. And for me, this was the end of my marriage at 33 was when my marriage ended. And, there's lots of reasons for that, complex reasons. And at the same time, that heartbreak also propelled me into, what's beyond this? Because I did live in like that nuclear fantasy, right? Of, there was a picket fence. I don't think it was white, but, there's a garden in the back and a dog and, the house in the burbs and all that stuff. That was my reality. And in many ways it was nice, and in many ways deeply unsatisfying because I felt like there has to be more than this, right? And part of that was also wanting to explore paradigms beyond, which ultimately, was too far afield for my wife at the time. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes one partner really wants to, keep pushing convention and exploring beyond, and the other just wants to, chill out and keep things as they are. And sometimes that gap can be too much. So it was actually in that heartbreak that is when Tamara had reached out and they said, hey, you know what? We're doing some interesting things with love and village and things like that. And do you want to come check it out and maybe make a film about us? Because they also had seen some of my filmmaking work. So I'd say, yeah, Tamara also was a complete reconfiguring of so many of these aspects like we've spoken to already, and like offering glimpses of what a kind of true relational field of mutual solidarity with men and women and support and really like investing in each other. Like, what does that actually look like, right? When we're not all kind of locked away in our little nuclear bubbles. And that touched for me a deep place of a kind of, like that longing for also a kind of love which, we don't really have this version of love in modern society. Like we've got sort of love of our kids, love of our partners and family, direct family. And then we might have love of, affinity groups, like soccer teams or, something like that, or sometimes even nation, of course, right? We can love of nation. But to have love of people that are co-creating the same thing as you, and, it's not a corporation, it's not a, charity, but it's like something else entirely. I would call that village. It's the love of village which is something that I think we all had. So many of us lived like this, right, in the not so ancient past. And so for me, that kind of put everything else in perspective, right? Like the romantic love and the nuclear life and all that suddenly was like, oh, that's what we have left because everything else is mostly lost, right? It's not a fantasy ideal romance. I mean, the romance is kind of what makes it seem ideal, but it's actually all that's left. And so, yeah, that changed a lot for me, and all that willingness to then proceed differently of like, how can we recreate? What does it take to rebuild trust? That's like a key piece of it. How do we come back into right relationship, men and women, masculine, feminine? Again, where we're both caught in the same, you could call it patriarchal or colonial matrix, but it's like we're actually on the same team, or we should be, right? And so, how do we come back to that and heal together?
Yeah, I agree. And how fantastic you got to go straight from this quite conventional model family relationship structure straight to Tamara. Like that's quite an extreme contrast.
Uh huh. Yeah, I mean, there was a few stops along the way. I went to Burning Man, a number of times, and kind of experienced different, subcultures that, anywhere from non-monogamy and polyamory and plant medicines, all that kind of stuff was swirling around at the same time too. So that all helped a bit.
Yes, yes, yes. So, mind expansion experiences can help, right? And in all different ways. It doesn't have to just be plant medicine, I'm sure. Um,
Hmm.
the curiosity to follow that for men is quite important in this process, right? Deconstructing this unsustainable model of patriarchy that has, made its way inside as an actual frame that you see life through, that you see women through, that you see relationship and intimacy through as a man. And so these experiences that you can, well, it's so available. It's so available now like never before. So it would really come down to that curiosity, that impulse inside to want to explore what's outside of that conventional paradigm, right?
Hmm.
Have the courage to
And
follow.
I would say too that men, it's probably true for humans in general, but we're often motivated by pain, right? And I would say for men as well, if they're dissatisfied with the ways they're operating and the life that they're living and the relationships that they're having and the sex that they're having, and like that can be a something to reflect on, right? And say, wait a second, okay, so what is it actually that I need to let go of, right, to move beyond, right, the too narrow confines of this, sometimes they call it the man box, right, but the kind of cage, the conditioning that we've been put under, and what's beyond it. Actually, they have to have a whisper of actually there's something more deep and more fulfilling, and just a more in service to the times, that I think also men have that seed, right, of wanting to be useful, deeply useful, right? There's something around masculinity that really feels that that's a key aspect, right? Pat McCabe again, she calls men in this case, or the masculine, architects of the dream, right? As a beautiful mythic image. And so I think men want that actually, and are, maybe trapped in a paradigm that they also want out of, if they could, really be courageous enough.
Yes, yes. Thank you for voicing that. And that's really beautiful. There's so many different types of people and, you know, the configuration of their spirit and their psychology. But a quite a common place is learning through pain, that what they have been living is not sustainable. Like it can't continue. There is an end point. And oftentimes that can go to, well, she doesn't want to comply to this anymore. There's a lot of that happening in the world as patriarchy is falling away to reveal something more true that's available for everyone, right? And so often that place of being in uh, sadness, anger, despair, blame, um, usually and hopefully that can eventually lead a man towards men's work, right? To find an environment that can give him a different context and give him meaning and understanding about what he might be going through outside of just his personal relationship dissolving, perhaps. And
Hmm.
understand that a lot can open up for men through. deep men's work.
Yeah, I actually have a phrase came to me with a conversation with a friend of mine, Eamon Armstrong, who actually back in 2016, I think we toured around and we actually spoke to men. And I remember at one festival, it might have been Earth Frequency or Rainbow Serpent, but yeah, I was giving a talk. It was a mixed group, but I was speaking to the men. Actually, first I said to the women, how many of you women here are in women's groups of some kind, women's circles? And I'd say about half, put up their hands. And again, I think I might have been around Melbourne or one of these places, but and then I asked the men, how many men are in men's groups? Nobody put up their hand, not one man. I mean, this was about 8 or 9 years ago, so it's probably changed a bit, but no man put up their hand. And one guy in the back actually goes, "What would we talk about?" Which I thought was just such a good, right? There's this like, what? Why would he even do that? Right? It was just so beyond the beyond. But I was trying to make the case. I was like, well, you know what? There could be some real value in doing that. And, again, I think I've seen different men's groups popping up now in Australia and everything. So they're doing some good work. But yes, there's a kind of willingness to be defeated that is required. And I say this as, the hero in the archetypal framework is an adolescent archetype, right? And it's in many ways you could say the dominant culture right now is stuck at the hero, right? Because we either have the hero of the kind of lone individual, man striving and achieving, a bit like Andrew Tate, sees himself as a hero, or we have the shadow hero, which is the tyrant, right? Which is again, they think they're doing the good, right? But they're actually, causing a lot of harm.
Yeah.
And so again, but it's still an adolescent psychology because of the lack of rites of passage and the necessity of actually to move along consciousness to properly find its place for men. But in that adolescence, there's a sense of I can do it all myself, right? And so this is what I mean by actually men's work really begins with the willingness to be defeated and to actually say, wow, I actually can't do it all on myself. And so I call men's work the League of Failed Heroes.
Wow, wow. I can almost hear or sense the men that are like not ready to admit that, not not don't want to be involved in that club, you know. But that's the need to perceive himself in a way which is like proving himself to the world still in that hero archetype, and maybe hasn't experienced enough suffering perhaps, and the lack of longevity of that particular approach.
Yeah, and I think because being willing to ask for help, right, is vulnerable again, and a lot of men struggle with that. And so when I say you're willing to be defeated by your own limitation, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means you can't do everything. And so when a man can show up like that and realizes actually what's possible within, in this case, men's work, where other men can hold the masculine pole, right? For example, in ritual space, and they realize, oh, I can now put down that holding the masculine pole for a moment or for a time, an hour, 2 hours or something. The wild thing appears, right? Which is suddenly there's more access to the spectrum of existence, of experience, right? More access to emotions because you're not like holding on to them the whole time. Because now you can access the range also includes joy, right? And more joy and connection and solidarity with other men, which a lot of men miss, right? I mean, loneliness epidemic is rife, particularly for men. Suicide, right, from being alone and a loneliness. So it's a tragedy because again, of what's possible and very close actually, but it takes the courage, right, to admit limitation and to seek out other men and of course trusted mentors and advisors.
Yes, it does. And I would, because I've been in this deep initiation work for the majority of my life. I started working with people therapeutically in 1997, and, was very interested in all these kinds of things from a really young age, like some kind of little weirdo freak because no one else around me was doing that. But having seen the progression over time, I agree that it's probably in the last 8, 9 years that men's work has become really popular, Australia and beyond. But what I see with that, it's a similar thing in the women's work as well. But talking about the men, because it's become popular, there are men that gravitate to it and they haven't actually gone through that deconstruction of patriarchy inside of them. So they're still bringing that hero energy and aren't clearly seeing the differentiation of, say, manosphere rhetoric and the deeper mythic perspective that you would come from someone who's taken a deeper inner journey. And that can be very confusing. I imagine that can be really confusing for guys that are newer to this terrain, looking at, well, who do I listen to? I'm getting a lot of conflicting messages, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where it's seductive to follow those that seem certain, right? So that's a clue. Actually, if any mentor or guide is very certain of themselves, that's usually a red flag, right? Because there's something lacking in the capacity to, I would say, capacity to wonder, right? To wonder about these things from a deeper place, and kind of occupy a deeper wellspring of wisdom. And really, this is also the energy of the trickster, which in the sort of primordial mythic archetypal soil, there's a fellow named Alan V. Chin, and he wrote a book after Iron John called Beyond the Hero. And he makes the case that it's actually the trickster is the older masculine archetype. Of course, trickster shows up and is multigendered and everything. But this idea that the elder and the trickster are very close together, right? Because they have the capacity to see the duality, right, in the dance between duality, and it's not so hard, black and white. This is the way it is, which is often the realm of the patriarch, right? The oppositional binary. It's this or it's that, or it's this against that, right? So it's the older trickster energy that I find I trust more, of course, in mentors and elders, where generally the answer is not so much it's this or that, but it depends, right? It depends is actually a highly contextual, nuanced understanding of how the world works. And so, again, I'd be nervous if any man feels too certain. And also, it is not like an automatic kind of, man gets transformed because he went to men's circle. I get emails occasionally too from women who've written and said, my man did men's work for years and our relationship got worse, right? And she spoke about these things, right? Because I think it started to be like this kind of, in group of men that just, were kind of so sure of themselves and kind of like occupied again a kind of bravado and on kind of overconfidence and actually weren't doing the inner work, the deeper soul work, which to me is actually the fundament, rather than these kind of displays of bravado and achievement, convincing each other of our own grandiosity. So that's also a bit suspect. If you're not going deeper, then it may not be the right group.
Yes, and embodiment is probably the main key to differentiate these different personas and be able to identify them basically. But it also takes embodiment to be able to see that clearly.
For
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I I feel like I could talk to you for hours because you're probably like the closest male equivalent to the mythosomatic work that I do with women and this very deep body of female psychology work that has emerged from so many years of the embodiment practice itself. And so I feel like there's so many topics we could talk on for hours, but there's a couple of things in particular that I wanted to ask you while we're here. And one of them is connected to what you said before. Then a man finding in himself um, the willingness to be defeated, the willingness to realize the end of the paradigm that he's been running with, and that there is another possibility. Because I saw the masculine archetypes. I mean, I'm aware of the archetypes that many people work with in transpersonal spaces. And from seeing one of your presentations and sort of the Western world archetypes that men tend to focus on, I was wondering what your take is on, and it may just be what you've said, that willingness to be defeated, but do you know who Gina Muster is?
I
In the
don't.
Okay, so I have a huge photo of her in a framed picture in the other room. She's one of my favorites. So she's the image of her is that she's cut off her own head. So whereas Kali will cut off the heads of the demons in this fiercely loving, protective Kali Ma capacity, Shinamasta is this, you know, living consciousness archetype inside of us. Well, she will sever her own head to nourish, those around her. So it's like Shiva the Destroyer is maybe the closest, but of the inner kind. And I wondered, is there an archetype in the more Western mythic terrain for men to connect to around that being a desirable thing to aim for?
Hmm. And by that meaning to be uh like dissolved
Empowering.
or say
Like
it again?
it's
Yeah.
in your favor, like it's something empowering, like it's not this sense of defeated and you're collapsed and you've lost instead of winning as a hero, you've lost. It's something much deeper than that, right? And so I just wondered while you're here if you know about an equivalent of that in the Western archetypes that people tend to focus on.
It's interesting. I mean, what comes to me is I mean, certainly there's the aspect of the green man, right, in Celtic mythology, which is, again, seems to be differentiated from the wild man, which is sort of what Bly talks a lot about in Iron John, which is more, again, this primordial, like undomesticated aspect of masculinity. But there's something in the green man for me as well, which is like, again, a reoccurring presence within Celtic sort of lore and architecture and things like that, which seems to indicate a kind of masculinity which is like kind of growing and dissolving and interwoven with the fabric of life itself. So in that sense, it's like constantly returning to soil and being renewed. Like there's an aspect there of masculinity. I mean, I would strongly recommend you speak to a friend of mine, a colleague, Sophie Strand, as well, right, who wrote a book called The Flowering Wand. And she spends a lot of time actually unearthing a lot of other masculine deities and models from, Osiris to Jesus, who are also a part of this kind of like giving oneself, like being dismembered and giving oneself and resurrecting, again, which is certainly an ongoing motif as well, too many to be ignored. That's actually also a piece, right? Rather than this kind of triumphant ascending masculinity that, is sort of up and out and off to the cosmos, right? Which is mirrors very well the technocratic kind of live forever crowd, right? Which is all about actually denying the death or denying the dissolution of oneself and, the mind consciousness needing to persist forever. Again, which is also part of that symptom of that fear of actually dissolving once again and returning, I believe, to her, to the goddess.
Yes, yes. And this is been my own wondering from my look into what men are doing with mythic men's work, because it's like, I wonder if there's space for a new archetype actually to emerge, and talking about the beyond, it would make sense if there was something new that emerged, right? Rather than just going on the ones we've had before. And the cutting off of her own head when it comes to Chena Muster, there is that energy in there where it has an altruistic outcome. It's nourishing and sustaining of life to everyone around her, but it's also the impulse for her own development, for her own empowerment to cut off her own ego, right? To stay in touch with the part of herself that can initiate that for her own well-being, let's say. And so the male equivalent of that, the masculine equivalent of that, um, yeah, that was my own mythic wondering there that came up.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think Sophie could be on the trail. I recommend reaching out to her. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. And the other thing is, Ian, about so patriarchy in the way that it takes shape in men in relationship and intimacy, because this project is not just about sex, even though it's called patriarchal, beyond patriarchal sex. It's about all of it, the whole experience around it as well. Um, each of the men that I've spoken to so far on this podcast, there's something that I'm tracking that many have spoken where it's being revealed to me that it's patriarchy in the quite negative expression of it is less about women. It's almost as though women and girls are collateral damage in the process of this assertion to each other as men that they are winning, that they are on top, that they are the hero. So to me, it really does seem to be an issue amongst men, and others suffer from what can go on in that. Because the emphasis seems to be a lot about the war between men and women. And I'm just seeing more and more that this is something between men and men to be figured out, to be seen in a way that maybe it hasn't been seen before. I
Hmm.
was wondering on your thoughts about that.
Well, I think it'd be useful to, I mean, just ask a slightly different question to start too, which um, is it possible to separate men and women from the organism called humanity? Right. And I say that to mean not that those of us who have been conditioned and socialized as men or occupy male bodies don't have a particular responsibility, which we do. Uh, and also, I think it makes sense to ask the question too, well, what is the particular responsibility that women have, uh, right, as part of this organism affected by what we could call this, domination society or patriarchal field or whatever you want to call it. So in that sense, I just get nervous of this idea. Maybe you might be hinting at of kind of like carving out it so it's like only men can work on it and then sort of come back and like heal patriarchy and come back. Is that kind of what you're hinting at, or am I not quite understanding?
Just sort of the roots of it. I mean, all my work with women is about recognizing where uh, it's been internalized inside of us, patriarchy, and where we endure it and enable it with men. Like that's just super present in everything that I do. So I don't mean at all to say that there's no responsibility on behalf of women. No way. I would never claim that. But tracking the kind of impulse of where it arises from, even like the uh, when it comes to the talking about conquering sexual conquest and that being about scoring points amongst the brothers, and I mean, one of the most powerful places, isn't it, to restore a more whole, empowering, holistic paradigm is between father and son, right? And so it just seems to me like there's so much room to explore um, this need to be perceived in a certain way by other men, and why is that so prevalent? And is that not a disempowering thing eventually to be stuck in that? And actually saw it as maybe an empowering thing, like this is something that can be followed through on, this is something that can be actioned, rather than people seeing it as just this war between men and women.
Hmm. Well, again, if I'm getting the question right, or I think I am, just that men also have a very particular and necessary um, need to actively participate in shifting this field and to model different kinds of masculinity as well. And I mean, you pinpointed as well the relationship between father and son, and certainly, yeah, as a father is willing to work at his pain and his patterns, so that sets the son up to be also more integrated, right, and less needing to also do the work of his father, right, which is so often the case that it just kind of keeps going on down the family line. So yes, I think it's also an iterative process too, as it moves generation to generation. And I mean, for my son as well, like I was probably in a first kind of circle, like council circle, with other humans in like a certain fashion, right, of coming together in sort of a village way. Probably my first time was like 35 or something like that. And my son, he's been to Tamara. He was actually at Tamara at 6 months. He came with us for that final shoot, but he also has been in so many circles and village gatherings and rituals and ways at he's almost 6, but I certainly believe he's much further ahead in understanding right ways of being together that is in collaboration, in partnership, in solidarity, and seeing like other trusted men that are close to him as well, then he can look to for guidance and all these things. So again, I see it as this a multi-generational unfolding that, yeah, certainly men, the more men are willing to do that work and to model a different way, the more it affects the generations to come and keeps rippling out from there.
Yeah. And I think a different way of expressing what I was attempting to say as well could be that, the focus on men harming women, sometimes it's less about the man trying to cause that damage and more about being seen in a certain way by the eyes of the men around him because of an insecure internal identity. Um, yeah, yeah. But it's
So yeah, so I'm hearing though that yeah, the need to essentially have men call each other up in terms of certain patterns of behaviors. Is that also what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I believe in men's work that that's what's already happening. I was just curious about like a root place of where that comes from amongst men.
Well, I mean, again, I think it goes back to the domination hierarchy, which is where, I mean, a man is at a disadvantage in a domination hierarchy if he doesn't have, certain economic status and influence, and he also tends to translate to women, right? Control over women and women's bodies. I mean, just look at someone like Trump. I mean, and the whole Epstein thing. I mean, that's really indicative, I think, of a kind of archetypal example of exactly that. That patriarchal power and influence means, control and consumption of female bodies. And so that as a construct, yeah, that's a distortion in men that needs to be alchemized, and through all the ways in which we've been speaking, certainly.
Yeah, yeah. And we are coming to the close of our time here, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you feel called to speak to that you feel like we didn't get to touch on of what you'd like to contribute to the conversation around patriarchal sex and living beyond it.
Yeah, I would just say that again. I would want to encourage that. I think the patriarchal constructs are just such a very narrow place to live, and I do, like the idea of kind of gently persuading. I mean, in particular, say men and the possibilities of actually what's out there that is much more fulfilling and nourishing and deep and ecstatic, and all of these things actually, which are beyond, right? Again, the narrow conditioning and confines in which they might be operating. And so I just want to highlight that. So it's not so much about giving something up. I
Yeah.
mean, it is giving up, a distortion and a very narrow conditioning, but it's actually about gaining access to an entire palette of sensual and beautiful possibility. That I mean, I don't see why you wouldn't want to access that, if you had the opportunity.
So the gentle persuasion, I have to ask you, what could that look like? And you started to say, so that's through the expanded pleasure potential. That's, what else is possible in sex, even though some guys get reactive around that, like, what's wrong with how I am? But what are some suggestions around gentle persuasion?
Well, I think this conversation is hopefully persuasive to men that are listening. But again, what I teach often is for men to again open themselves up to a wider field of eros as life energy, and in terms of the erotic space as well, it's about letting go of destination within an erotic encounter. That it's not about just getting to orgasm and that's the high five or the win or whatever. That it's actually about surrendering into play. Actually, play is the most kind of equivalent example of that, where people play because they don't play for something. I mean, I'm not talking about like a sports game. I'm just saying just the act of generative play. Kids do this, right? They just play, and they just conjure a whole other worlds, and it's play for play's sake. And for me, that's actually the spirit of the lover. That's the archetype of the deep lover, is that it's actually about play and without destination and discovery and no doubt other sensual possibilities, right, that emerge from the willingness to play and let go of I'm
Yeah.
supposed to do this right. I'm supposed to do this a certain way. And get curious again about each other. I interviewed Starhawk, who you probably know, a little while back, and she spoke about this idea that she's like, the number one thing men need to learn about women, if they, if they really want to do well with women, just listen to them. So she said, she's just listen to the women. Like they're kind of like telling you stuff. I mean, if we're talking about, things they like or, all this stuff. And there's this idea, I think, with men that they have to like know what to do already or like decipher a woman without actually having to ask. And maybe a lot of women are actually, I read an article recently saying that a lot of women are actually don't know that they could just say because maybe the man didn't show interest. But again, this idea of, getting curious, being willing to ask. You don't have to be an expert, just be willing. And that's a much more, fun and fulfilling place to be when you let go of the script and just sink into presence and the experience itself.
That's exactly it. In the generative play of children, that there's just being totally absorbed into the moment. There's no pre-rehearse, well, we're doing this now. It all just unfolds moment by moment. And it's like that in lovemaking when both people are present. So I'm really glad that you spoke to that sense of play and discovery and exploration. And what a relief it must feel like for a man to feel like, oh, okay, so I'm not expected to be in this role where I have to know everything and what's going to happen next. And there's this pattern, there's this routine that I've got to follow. Actually, yeah, that can fall away. And the true meeting of each other and each other's bodies gets to happen in that
Hmm.
experience. And yeah, what a
Hmm.
relief. What a relief for a man who's had to, told himself because he got the idea from porn and whatever else that he has to have this repertoire that he's modeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I maybe I end it with a few words from Rumi, of course, but in his beautiful poem, Bread Making, there's the line where he says, the way that you make love is the way that God will be with you.
So beautiful. Thank you, Ian, for coming and meeting me in this conversation. I really appreciate your awareness and your time and your heart and your energy. And I love the sound of the men's work that you're doing. Um,
Hmm.
I imagine that there'll be men listening to this that'll be like, Ian MacKenzie, what is he up to? What is he offering? So, what is alive at the moment and where can they find you?
Hmm. Sure. Well, the mythicmasculine.com, they can find podcasts, things like that, a few free webinars for men that can meet me in person. This is primarily in Vancouver Island or in Canada. There's in-person events that we do called Awakening the Wild Erotic. Level 2, by the way, is called Eating the Shadow, which is all about kind of encountering your wild twin, which is amazing. But I also have an online program co-created with my collaborator, Deus Fortier, which is called The Deep Masculine, which is basically everything I've learned over the last decade with the mytho-poetic lineage, story of Iron John, but also mixing in embodiment practices, breath work, ritual, things like that. And that, again, that's accessible for men anywhere in the world. And that's, again, at themythicmasculine.com.
I love the sound of all of that. Thank you so much for meeting me today.
Thanks for having me.
Now that you just listened to this episode, tell me about your experience of this in the new voice note feature. You'll see the link for it underneath the description. Whether you're a man or a woman, I welcome you to express yourself. Tell me what you want to hear more about. Ask a question or share a perspective that you want to bring. Even if you disagree, it's all welcome. And I will respond to your message by weaving it into future episodes. When you subscribe to this podcast or share it with friends or leave a review, know that it genuinely does help to bring more interesting speakers into this project, which is inspiring more people to have genuine connection and understanding and love and intimacy. And may we all be free from suffering.